I noticed that look in a very small moment. It was not big enough to be called an event, but it was long enough that I could not forget it. At that dinner, Lena sat across from me, and my mother, Margaret, sat beside her. While I was telling a trivial story about work, I saw their eyes meet. Not quickly, not in surprise. Just a look that lasted longer than it should have. Too long for a relationship I had always believed was harmless. Our house in Savannah was always quiet. The old oak floor creaked softly under footsteps. The porch carried the scent of magnolia, and the yellow lights made everything look gentler than it truly was. I had always believed this place was the safest space for my family. I never thought that in that very space, something was growing silently, right in front of me. I am Asher Knight, an ordinary husband, a son who always tried to fulfill his duties. Lena is my wife, gentle, intelligent, and always carrying a loneliness I had never fully understood. And Margaret, my mother, is a woman who spent her entire life living for others and forgot how to live for herself. I used to think the two of them simply cared for each other in a family way. But from that night on, I began to doubt my own thoughts. Lena often felt jealous when I cared for my mother. She said it softly, gently, but there was always a scratch in her voice. Yet when my mother cared for Lena, she softened in a strange way. She smiled more, she spoke less, and the look she gave my mother was not the look of a daughter-in-law. I started noticing small details, the way Lena adjusted my mother's collar, the way my mother held Lena's hand longer than necessary, the silences that appeared when I entered the room, as if I had accidentally stepped into a world where I was not invited. That night I returned to the kitchen to get water. Most of the lights were off. Only a small lamp above the sink remained. Lena and my mother stood very close to each other, not touching, but not distant either. No one spoke. I heard their breathing, very softly. When they noticed me, both of them flinched and stepped apart at the same time, like two people suddenly called awake from a dream. No one explained. I did not ask. We returned to the living room as if nothing had happened, but from that moment I knew. An invisible boundary had just been touched. That night I lay beside Lena but could not sleep. I heard her breathing evenly, but my mind was not. I asked myself whom I was jealous of, my mother or my own wife. I asked myself whether I was imagining things, or whether I was simply the last person to realize the truth. In the days that followed, I chose to observe instead of avoid. I saw them search for each other with their eyes. I saw them avoid each other in front of me. I saw their pain, even though neither spoke it. I began to understand that their connection no longer belonged to the ordinary definition of family. One evening, I heard Lena whisper to my mother in the kitchen, "I have never been looked at the way you look at me." My mother did not answer, but I heard her breathing change. I stood outside, my hand on the door. I could open it. I could break everything. But I did not. I stepped back. For the first time in my life, I chose not to walk into the truth. I understood that from that moment on, my family had entered another shape. No one betrayed me with actions, but there are betrayals born from emotions that cannot be controlled. And I, Asher Knight, was the first one to know it, in silence. After that night, I began to realize that nothing could return to the way it used to be. None of us spoke about the moment in the kitchen, but it existed among the three of us like a fourth breath. I carried it with me while driving to work, while sitting in my office, while watching Savannah move slowly outside the window. I did not know what I was waiting to happen. I only knew that I was afraid of it happening. Savannah entered the first days of summer. The sky was clear, the sunlight strong, but the air always felt as if it clung to the skin. Our house felt the same way. Everything was still in its old place. My mother's armchair, Lena's coffee cup, my shoes by the door. But the feeling was different. It was no longer a peaceful home. It was more like a room where everyone carried something unsaid. I watched Lena more closely. I noticed the way she listened to my mother. Not the polite kind of listening, but the kind that made every word seem to touch a very deep part of her. I also watched my mother more closely. I saw her smile when Lena smiled, and fall silent when Lena fell silent. They were like two people learning how to breathe in the same rhythm. The jealousy inside me began to change its shape. It was no longer the irritation of a husband, nor the discomfort of a son. It felt like being placed outside a connection I could not enter. I was still there, still loved in the old way, but I was no longer at the center of the emotional world inside my own house. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. I saw the two of them sitting on the porch. Lena sat at my mother's feet, gently resting her head against her knee. My mother placed her hand on Lena's hair, not stroking, not holding, just resting there. That scene would have been harmless if I had not seen Lena's eyes close as if she were finding a shelter I had never been able to give her. When they noticed me, Lena immediately sat up straight. My mother pulled her hand back. Both of them smiled, but the smile was not the kind used to greet a family member. It was the smile of people who had just been seen in a moment more private than they wanted to admit. That night, Lena spoke very little. She ate slowly, looked at her plate more than at me. I wanted to ask, but I did not. I began to understand that if I asked, I would force them to choose between truth and safety. And I was not sure I was ready for the answer. Late at night, I woke up because I heard soft footsteps in the house. I did not look at the clock. I only knew that Lena was not lying beside me. I stayed still, listening to a door close very softly at the end of the hallway. I did not follow. I just lay there, letting my imagination draw the things I both wanted to know and was afraid to know. The next morning, Lena came into the kitchen with slightly red eyes. My mother looked at her for a long time. No one spoke. But in that silence, I felt an apology that was not said, and a promise that was also not spoken. I realized that their feelings were no longer accidental. They had become a choice, a silent choice, but a deliberate one. And I, the one in between, began to understand that I was no longer the person who decided the shape of this family. I still loved Lena. I still respected my mother. But I also began to understand that there are loves that do not need to be touched to be real. As long as they are seen, kept in silence and hidden long enough, they can still change the fate of 3 people. And I knew that from this chapter on, I was no longer just an observer. I had become a part of a secret I had never asked to keep. I began to grow used to waking up without knowing whether I was living in a family or inside a prolonged silence. Every morning, the Savannah sunlight came through the curtains just like always. But inside me, everything was slightly misaligned. Not enough to be called broken, just enough to make me unable to stand firmly in my own thoughts. Lena changed in a way that was very difficult to grasp. She was not cold toward me. She was not distant. But in every sentence I felt that she was holding back a part I could no longer touch. My mother was the same. She still asked if I had eaten, if I was tired, how my work was going. But her eyes no longer stayed on me for long. They often passed over me, searching for someone else in the same room. We lived together, yet I began to feel that I was the only one who no longer knew where I belonged. One rainy afternoon, Savannah sank into a gentle gray. I came home early. The front door was not locked. I stepped inside very quietly, not on purpose. But that quietness allowed me to hear them. Not clear voices, just scattered sounds, very soft, as if they were trying to keep everything as small as possible. I stopped at the end of the hallway. I could not see them, but I knew they were in the living room. I heard a chair move slightly. I heard a long breath. And then, silence. That silence was not emptiness. It was filled with things that were not allowed to be spoken. I stepped forward. When I appeared at the living room door, Lena and my mother were sitting across from each other, not touching. But the distance between them was far smaller than the distance between me and them. Lena looked at me first. My mother looked down. No one flinched. There was only a very thin, but very clear tension. I asked what they were talking about. Lena answered that it was just trivial things. Her voice was calm. Too calm. My mother said nothing, only nodded. I realized that from that moment on, they had begun to protect each other. Not with words, but with silent agreement. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my study, looking out at the dark garden. I asked myself where I was standing in this relationship. As a husband? As a son? Or merely as a supporting character in the story of 2 women I loved in 2 different ways? I remembered Lena's eyes when she looked at my mother. They were no longer searching for approval. They were searching for presence. I also remembered my mother's eyes when she looked at Lena. They were no longer the eyes of an elder looking at a child. They were the eyes of someone seeing herself again. I began to understand that between them, there was a very deep recognition. A recognition I could not enter, even though I was the closest person to both of them. The next day, Lena wore a dress I had never seen her wear before. It was not striking, but it was different from her. My mother looked at her for a long time, then turned away. But I saw her hands slightly tremble as she held her teacup. Lena caught my eyes. She looked at me for a moment, then lowered her gaze. In that moment, I knew she was carrying guilt. Not because she loved, but because she could not stop loving. That evening, when I went out to buy some things, I returned earlier than planned. I opened the door very quietly. In the living room, I saw Lena standing close to my mother. They were not touching, but they stood close enough for me to feel the tension in the air. When they heard the door, both of them turned around. No one spoke. But I saw the same thing in their eyes. Fear of being discovered, and fear of having to stop. I did not speak. I simply walked past them and went upstairs. But when I closed the door, I heard both of them sigh at the same time. That night, Lena came into the bedroom very late. She lay down beside me, turning her back to me. I did not hold her. I did not turn toward her. But I felt her body tremble very slightly, as if she were trying to keep something inside herself. I understood that from this chapter on, that relationship was no longer a possibility. It had become a reality. A reality no one named, but everyone was living inside. And I, Asher Knight, began to learn how to exist in a family where love no longer followed familiar straight lines. I began to realize that I no longer asked questions. Not because I did not want to know, but because I was afraid to know. The questions stopped right before my lips, as if saying just one word would cause the entire fragile shape of this family to collapse. Savannah moved deeper into summer. The midday sun made the streets bright and pale, and the evenings were longer, more humid, heavier. Inside the house, no one spoke much. Each of us kept our own rhythm of breathing, and we began to learn how to avoid each other through very small movements. Lena no longer came to me to tell stories. My mother also no longer chose to sit beside me for long as she used to. I was not abandoned, but I was displaced. Like a chair still in the room, but no longer in the central position. One afternoon, I saw Lena standing in the garden, looking up at the magnolia tree in front of the porch. My mother stood behind her, a few steps away. No one touched anyone. But I felt an invisible thread pulling them closer than any physical distance. I stood at the door, watching that scene. And for the first time, I understood what it felt like to stand outside my own life. That evening when we ate dinner, Lena almost did not eat. She only moved the food back and forth on her plate. My mother looked at her, then looked at me. Her eyes carried something that felt like apology, but also like determination. After dinner, I heard the sound of water in the bathroom longer than usual. Lena stayed in there for a long time. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her face was calm. I looked at her, but she did not look at me. I went out to the porch. The Savannah wind blew softly, carrying the scent of flowers and moisture. I heard footsteps behind me. My mother stood beside me, saying nothing. We looked into the darkness ahead. After a while, my mother spoke very softly. Have you ever felt that you lived your life wrong, Asher? I did not answer right away. I did not know whether she was asking about me or about herself. I only said that perhaps everyone had felt that way at some point. My mother nodded. She did not look at me. She looked into the darkness. And in that moment, I understood that she was carrying something too heavy to be shared in words. That night I heard Lena cry. Not loudly, not sobbing, just very small sounds, pressed down. I stood in front of the study door, where light slipped through the crack. I heard my mother's voice very soft. Don't hate yourself. You did not choose your heart. Lena did not answer. There was only trembling breathing. I placed my hand on the door. Once again, I could walk in. I could be the husband, the son, the one who breaks everything. But I did not. I stepped back. I returned to the bedroom. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling and felt myself breaking into very small pieces. The next morning, no one mentioned that night. Lena smiled at me. My mother made coffee. Everything returned to normal. But I knew that from then on, Every normal thing was only a surface. I realized that they were no longer only loving each other in silence. They were protecting each other. They were shielding each other from the judgment of the world, and also from me. Not because they did not love me, but because they did not know where to place me in their love. I began to understand that my role in this story was not simply that of a betrayed man. I was standing between a love I did not belong to, but also could not leave. That night, I watched Lena sleep. Her face was more peaceful than during the day. I wondered whether, when she slept, she still had to fight her feelings. I wondered whether, in her dreams, she was allowed to love without fear. I also thought about my mother, about the years she lived for others, about the things she never allowed herself to have. And I understood that some stories do not need a great climax. They only need a small truth, deep enough, to change everything. This chapter ended there. Not with a word, not with an action, but with a very slow, very painful, and very silent acceptance inside me. Asher Knight began to learn how to exist in a family where love no longer belonged to familiar boundaries. I began to learn how to look directly at the things I had once avoided. Not because I had become braver, but because I was too tired to continue pretending. Every morning when I opened my eyes, I no longer hoped that everything was just a misunderstanding. I only hoped I was calm enough to keep living in the new shape of this family. Savannah was still as beautiful as ever. The sunlit roads, the silent rows of trees, the wooden houses carrying unchanged peace. But inside me, the city felt like a painting hung slightly crooked. No one noticed, but the one living inside it always felt uncomfortable. Lena spoke to me a little more. Not to become closer, but as if to keep a safe distance. My mother did the same. She cared for me with very careful gentleness, as if afraid that one wrong gesture would make me realize something she was not ready to face. One morning, I saw the two of them standing in the kitchen. Lena was holding a glass of water. My mother stood very close, slightly leaning toward her. They said nothing, but their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. When they noticed me, both of them turned away quickly. I no longer felt surprised. I only felt a very clear emptiness inside me. I began to understand that between them, there was not only affection, there was also a desire to reach for each other, restrained by fear and guilt. That restraint made their connection tighter, deeper, and more dangerous. That afternoon, I sat alone in my study. I heard them talking in the living room. I could not hear the content, only short sentences, long pauses. I heard Lena laugh very softly. Then I heard my mother sigh. I realized I was listening to two people in love who were not allowed to live as lovers. When I stepped out, they immediately fell silent. I saw Lena's hand resting on my mother's hand, not gripping, not pulling away, just resting. I stood there for a few seconds. No one moved. No one explained. Then they slowly let go, as if they had just remembered that I still existed. That moment did not hurt in a dramatic way. It hurt in a quiet way, like a very thin cut, but deep enough to bleed for a long time. That night, Lena told me she was tired. She did not say why. I did not ask why. We began to communicate with weightless sentences, as if both of us were afraid to touch the thing lying between us. The night fell very slowly. I lay beside Lena, listening to her breathing. I did not touch her, not because I did not want to, but because I knew that inside her, there was another person present in a way I could not compete with. I turned toward the wall. I felt Lena turn toward me, then turn away again. Between us was a space that could not be named. I remembered all the years we had lived together, the days I believed love was enough. I had never thought that one day my love would become only a small part of the emotional world of the woman I married. The next morning, my mother told me she wanted to walk at Forsyth Park. I agreed to go with her. Lena also came. The three of us walked side by side, but I felt that I was walking behind the two of them. When Lena stopped by the pond, my mother stood very close to her. The wind blew gently, sending Lena's hair toward my mother. My mother raised her hand, hesitated for a second, then lowered it. Lena turned to look at her. Their eyes met. I stood behind them, watching that entire moment as someone viewing his own life from another angle. I understood that they were trying to restrain themselves, but that very restraint made me more certain of what they were feeling. On the way home, no one spoke. but I knew that their relationship had passed the boundary of misunderstanding. It had become a choice they did not know how to end, and I did not know how to face. This chapter ended in a very quiet afternoon. But inside me, nothing was quiet anymore. I understood that from now on, none of our steps would be accidental. Every look, every silence, every restrained touch was an unspoken confession. And I, Asher Knight, began to realize that there are loves that do not need to be spoken, yet are still powerful enough to change an entire family. I began to understand that truth does not need to be spoken to become a burden. It only needs to exist long enough in a room with 3 people to change every breath. I carried that feeling with me from the bedroom to the kitchen, from the porch to the study, from morning to night, like a shadow with no shape, but always right behind me. Lena and my mother became more careful. Not careful with each other, but careful with me. They spoke more briefly when I was near. They kept just enough distance not to be seen as too close, but not far enough to return to the way they were before. That exact balance exhausted me more than any clear distance could. One afternoon I sat alone in my study. The door was open. I heard Lena and my mother in the living room. They talked about an old movie, about a song, about very ordinary things. But their voices were different, softer, slower, as if every sentence carried something that was not allowed. I did not step out. I just sat there, letting that artificial normality pass on its own. When I appeared, both of them continued the conversation, but their eyes passed over each other very quickly, like a silent signal I had become too familiar with. I no longer tried to break it. I simply stood inside it. That evening, I told Lena that I felt as if I was slowly disappearing inside my own family. I spoke very gently, without blame. She looked at me for a long time, then turned away. She said she was sorry, but in her voice, I did not hear regret. I only heard helplessness. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in the middle of the room, listening to Lena's breathing and thinking about my mother. I thought about those 2 women, each carrying a part of life that had never been fully lived. And I began to understand that I was not the center of this story. I was only the one standing between 2 emotional currents that had existed before I even realized them. The next morning, my mother suggested going to church. Lena agreed. I went with them. The 3 of us sat on the same bench, but I felt invisible spaces between us. When everyone stood to pray, I saw Lena gently close her eyes. My mother did the same. And in that moment I realized they were praying not only for peace, but for forgiveness. After the service, we walked slowly across the small square. Lena walked beside my mother. I walked 1 step behind. I heard them talk about very light things, but in every sentence I heard a closeness I no longer belonged to. I began to understand that their love was not only attraction, it was recognition. Recognition of a part of themselves in the other. And when people find themselves in another person's eyes, it becomes very difficult for them to return to who they used to be. That evening I sat alone in the living room. My mother and Lena were in the kitchen. I heard the soft clinking of dishes. I heard Lena laugh quietly. I heard my mother answer. Very ordinary sounds, yet I felt in them an intimacy that needed no touch. When they came out, I saw the same thing in both of their eyes. They were trying to live like ordinary people, even though they knew they were no longer ordinary. I stood up and said I would go out for a walk. Lena looked at me as if she wanted to say something, then fell silent. My mother only nodded. I walked through the familiar streets of Savannah. Yellow streetlights, gentle wind, the scent of damp leaves. The city was the same. Only I was changing. I began to understand that I could not force anyone back into their old shape. I could only choose how I would exist in their new one. When I returned, Lena was asleep. My mother was already in her room. The house was quiet. I stood in the hallway for a long time before entering the bedroom. I lay down, looked at Lena, and understood that my love for her was no longer enough to keep her in a world that belonged only to 2 people. But I also understood that I did not want to be the one who broke everything. I did not want to become the person who forced them to choose between happiness and morality. I only wanted to be someone mature enough to look straight at the truth without shattering it. This chapter ended when I realized I was no longer trying to stop them from loving. I was only trying to learn how to exist alongside that love, without losing myself. And I, Asher Knight, for the first time understood that some pains do not come from being abandoned, but from learning how to stand still while others walk toward a place you cannot follow. I began to realize that acceptance does not come from a sudden moment of clarity. It comes from many silent mornings in a row, when I open my eyes and no longer feel angry, yet cannot be calm either. I simply exist in a state in between, where every emotion is made smaller, so that life can continue. Lena and my mother no longer tried to hide from each other as before. Not because they were braver, but because hiding had become exhausting. They still kept their distance in front of me, but in their eyes, in the way they waited for each other to finish speaking, in the rhythm of their breathing when they stood close, I saw a silent acknowledgement that they could no longer turn back. One afternoon, I saw my mother sitting in the living room, rereading an old book. Lena sat across from her. No one spoke. Yet between them, there was a current that was calm and deep. I stood at the door and did not step in immediately. I was afraid that if I broke that moment, all three of us would have to force ourselves to become different people again. When I stepped inside, Lena looked at me first. Her eyes no longer avoided mine. They carried something like apology, but also something like determination. My mother looked at me next. Her eyes were deeper, heavier, and full of weariness. I understood that from now on, every silence between us was no longer unconscious. It was a choice. That evening, I told Lena that I knew. I did not say what I knew, but she understood. She sat for a long time, without crying, without reacting. Then she nodded very slightly. A nod not to confirm, but to accept that the truth had been seen. My mother stood at the kitchen door. She did not step in, but she heard. I knew she heard. No one apologized. No one justified anything. There was only a long silence, long enough for each of us to understand that from that moment on, we were no longer allowed to pretend. I said that I did not hate them. I said that I did not know what I should do. I said that I only knew I was in pain, but I did not want to turn that pain into a weapon. Lena looked at me for a long time. Then she spoke very softly. I never wanted you to become the one standing outside. That sentence did not make me lighter, but it made me understand that in this love, no one truly wanted to hurt anyone. It was only that no one knew how to love without hurting someone else. My mother stepped a little closer. She did not touch Lena. She did not touch me. She only stood there, between the two of us, like someone who had gone too far to turn back, but not far enough to leave. She spoke very softly. I'm sorry for not being strong enough to stop. I did not answer right away. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, and the woman who was living again a part of life she had once lost. I did not know whether I should be a son or a judge. I only said that perhaps none of us was strong enough to defeat our own hearts. That night, I went out for a long time. I walked through familiar streets, past rows of trees, past houses filled with light. I saw people living very ordinary lives, and I understood that my life was not abnormal. I was simply living in a place where every emotion had been pushed outside the frame. When I returned, Lena was sitting in the living room. She was not asleep. My mother had gone to her room. Lena looked at me, then lowered her head. She did not cry, but in her eyes I saw the exhaustion of someone who had loved too long in silence. I sat down across from her. We did not touch, but the distance between us was no longer the distance of two lovers. It was the distance of two people trying to hold on to something that had already changed. I told Lena that I did not know what our future would be, but I knew that if I stayed, I would not be able to stay as before. And if I left, I would not leave as a betrayed man, but as someone who had seen the entire truth. Lena nodded. She did not ask me to stay. She did not push me away. She only looked at me, as if looking at someone standing before a door that neither of us knew what lay beyond. This chapter ended when I stood up, walked toward the stairs, and paused for a second. I turned back to look at Lena. I did not say anything, but I knew that from that moment on, we had entered the final part of a story none of us had ever wanted to begin this way. And I, Asher Knight, understood that sometimes, loving is not about holding on, but about being brave enough to look directly at what has changed and accept that you no longer stand in the same place. I woke up very early. The house was still silent, as if it too was trying to hold on to the last breath of something about to end. The faint morning light spread through the window, touching the wooden floor, the familiar walls, the objects that had witnessed too many changes without ever speaking. I sat up and looked at Lena, still sleeping. Her face was peaceful, yet within that peace I could clearly see traces of exhaustion. I did not touch her. I only looked. And in that moment, I understood that my love for her no longer lay in holding her back, but in allowing her to be herself, even if that meant I had to leave. I walked out of the room. My mother was in the kitchen. Her back was turned to me. I stood behind her for a long time before she noticed. When she turned around, her eyes no longer avoided mine. They carried something like acceptance. We sat across from each other in the familiar kitchen. No one spoke at first. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, and who was also learning to live again for herself. I understood that she no longer wanted to run, and I no longer wanted to pretend. I told my mother that I would leave the house for a while. Not to punish, not to escape, but so that the three of us could breathe without carrying each other's eyes. My mother listened carefully. She nodded. She did not cry. She did not object. She only exhaled very softly, as if she had been waiting for that sentence for a long time. Lena walked into the kitchen. She looked at us. I looked at her. There were no tears, no reproaches, only a very slow, very deep understanding. I told Lena that I did not know what our future would be, but I knew that I did not want to turn my love into a battle. Lena stepped closer to me. She stood very close, but did not touch me. She said that she had once believed she could love without hurting anyone. But in the end, she understood that some loves are born carrying pain, not because they are wrong, but because they arrive at the wrong time. I nodded. I understood. I did not forgive as a winner. I only accepted as someone who had seen the entire story. I went upstairs and took a small bag. I did not bring many things. I did not want to turn my leaving into a declaration. I only wanted it to feel like a necessary pause. When I came down the stairs, both of them were standing below. Lena looked at me. My mother looked at me. No one held me back. No one pushed me away. I understood that the greatest respect they could give me at that moment was to let me choose. I stood at the door for a long time. I turned back to look at the house one last time. I did not see it broken. I only saw that it had changed its shape. And I understood that not every family ends in destruction. Some families simply are no longer the same as in the beginning. I opened the door. The early morning wind blew in, cool and light. I stepped outside. I did not turn back immediately. I stood on the doorstep for a few seconds and took a deep breath. In that moment, I was no longer the husband left outside. No longer the son pulled into the middle. I was only a person learning how to let go without resentment. I knew Lena and my mother would continue their path. Perhaps they would still suffer. Perhaps they would still struggle. But at least, they no longer had to live in the secrecy I had once witnessed. And I would begin another journey. Not to forget them, but to remember them in a way that no longer hurt me. I understood that love does not always end with staying. Sometimes love ends with learning how to walk away in silence, carrying everything that was once real. I walked down the steps. I moved toward the familiar road. Savannah was still there. The city did not change because of my story. But I had. This chapter ended in the moment I blended into the morning crowd. No one knew what I had just left behind. No one knew what I was carrying. But I knew. I, Asher Knight, had loved, had hurt, had understood, and finally had learned that maturity is not about holding on to what you love, but about being brave enough to let it go, without turning love into hatred. My story did not end with an answer. It ended with a silence large enough for me to begin again.